He wasn't supposed to believe her. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind that soaked through jackets and patients alike, turning sidewalks into mirrors and streetlights into blurred halos. Officer Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the taped-off search zone, boots planted in mud that clung like regret, his breath slow but uneven as if each inhale carried weight. 36 hours. That was how long his son had been missing. 36 hours of flashlights cutting through woods, of radios crackling empty updates, of hope thinning with every passing minute. The forest behind him stretched dark and endless, swallowing sound, swallowing answers. A single sneaker, caked in dirt, sat in an evidence bag on the hood of a cruiser, the only proof Ethan had been there at all. Daniel's hand hovered near it, but never touched. Some lines, once crossed, made things real in ways a man wasn't ready for. The officers around him moved with quiet urgency, their voices low, respectful, careful not to meet his eyes for too long. He wasn't just one of them tonight. He was something else, a father waiting at the edge of silence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet pine and distant asphalt, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the voice. Small, soft, out of place. Your son is still alive. Daniel didn't turn right away. He thought maybe he imagined it, the mind reaching for anything that sounded like hope. But then it came again, steadier this time, closer. My dog can find him. He turned. A girl stood just beyond the edge of the tape, no older than 8, her hair damp and clinging to her cheeks, her jacket too thin for the cold. Beside her sat a German shepherd, still as stone, its coat darkened by rain, its eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. Not curious, not afraid, watching. Daniel frowned, stepping toward them, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. You shouldn't be here, he said, voice firm but tired. Where are your parents? The girl didn't answer. She simply placed a small hand on the dog's neck, fingers threading into the thick fur as if grounding herself. He heard him, she said. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing back at the search team, then down at the dog. Heard who? The girl met his gaze without hesitation. Your son. The word hung there, fragile and impossible. Daniel shook his head slightly, the reflex of a man trained to separate fact from feeling. Kid, listen, we've got trained units working this area. K9 teams, drones, thermal imaging. We're doing everything we can. The dog shifted then, just enough to break the stillness. It stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and before Daniel could react, it lifted its head and gently pressed its nose against his right arm, against the ink etched into his skin. A faded tattoo of a shepherd's head, lines worn soft with time. Daniel stiffened. The contact wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even urgent. It was precise. The dog lingered there for a second, inhaling, then pulled back and looked up at him again, amber eyes steady, unblinking. Daniel swallowed, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. What's his name? He asked quietly. Rex, the girl said. He knows things. Daniel almost smiled at that, a reflex he didn't feel. All dogs know things. Not like this, she replied. No argument. No insistence. Just certainty. The rain softened for a moment, falling lighter, like the sky itself was listening. Behind Daniel, a radio crackled with another negative report. Grid search complete. No sign. He closed his eyes briefly, the sound echoing louder than it should have. When he opened them, Rex had already turned, facing away from the road, toward a narrow stretch of woods the teams had passed twice already. The dog didn't move yet. It just waited. Daniel looked at the girl. How did you get here? She hesitated, then shrugged slightly. We were supposed to. It wasn't an answer. Not one that fit anywhere in his training, in his logic, in the structure he'd built his life around. And yet, nothing about the last 36 hours had fit either. Daniel glanced back once more at the officers, at the flashing lights, at the system doing everything right and finding nothing. Then he looked at Rex. The dog took one step forward. Stopped. Looked back. Not leading. Not pulling. Inviting. Daniel felt it then. Not belief. Not yet. But something quieter. A shift. He reached for his radio, paused, then let his hand fall back to his side. Show me, he said. The girl nodded once, as if that had always been the answer. And without another word, Rex turned and walked into the dark, the sound of his paws soft against the wet earth, disappearing just enough to make Daniel take the first step after him. The forest swallowed the last trace of light within 10 steps. The glow of patrol cars fading behind them like a memory Daniel was not ready to let go of, yet could no longer reach. The ground shifted under his boots, soft and uneven, soaked from hours of rain that had turned the trail into something more instinct than path. Rex moved ahead with quiet certainty, not fast, not slow, just steady, as if each step had already been decided long before Daniel chose to follow. The girl walked beside the dog without hesitation, her small shoes sinking slightly into the mud, her breathing calm, untouched by the tension pressing against Daniel's chest. He glanced back once, just once, the faint flicker of red and blue lights barely visible through the trees, then forward again, committing without saying it out loud. "How far?" he asked, his voice lower now, shaped by the silence around them. The girl did not look at him when she answered. "Not far if we do not stop." The words felt strange, not childish, not uncertain, just placed, like they belonged to something older than her. Daniel tightened his jaw slightly and kept moving. Branches brushed against his jacket, damp leaves catching at his sleeves, the scent of earth rising thick and heavy with each step. Somewhere in the distance, water moved, a shallow stream or runoff from the storm, its quiet rhythm threading through the night. Rex slowed as they approached it, lowering his head, not to drink, but to listen. Daniel noticed it immediately. The dog was not searching the way trained units did, not zigzagging, not circling. It was following something else, something that did not leave tracks. "You said he heard him," Daniel said after a moment, his voice careful, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile thread they were walking along. "What does that mean?" The girl stopped at the edge of the water, her eyes fixed on the surface as rain tapped softly against it. "It is not like people here," she said. "It is like when you remember a voice even when no one is talking." Daniel frowned, the explanation settling somewhere just out of reach. He looked at Rex. The dog stepped into the shallow stream without hesitation, water rippling around his legs, then crossed to the other side and paused, turning his head slightly, as if waiting for Daniel again. Always waiting, never pulling. Daniel followed, the cold water seeping through his boots, sharp and grounding. On the other side, the terrain changed. The trees grew closer together, the air thicker, the ground less disturbed, like a place people avoided without knowing why. Daniel felt it immediately, a subtle shift, the kind that made the back of his neck tighten. This area was cleared, he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Twice." The girl nodded faintly. They were looking for what is easy to see. Rex moved again, angling slightly off what remained of any visible trail, pushing through a line of low brush that snapped softly under his weight. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed, pushing branches aside, ignoring the sting against his hands. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving only the sound of droplets falling from leaves, a quiet ticking that filled the spaces between their breaths. Time felt different here. Slower, thinner. Rex stopped abruptly, not with tension, not with alarm, but with purpose. He stood still, head slightly tilted, ears forward, his body aligned towards something Daniel could not yet see. The girl stepped up beside him, placing her hand lightly against his shoulder. "He is close," she said. Daniel's heart stuttered once, hard enough to make him aware of it. "Where?" he asked, scanning the darkness, trying to force shapes out of shadows. The girl lifted her hand and pointed, not far ahead, just beyond a cluster of fallen branches and half-buried debris. At first, Daniel saw nothing. Just earth, leaves, the quiet remains of something forgotten. Then his eyes adjusted. A shape, angular, wrong against the natural lines of the forest. Metal, partially covered, half sunken into the ground as if time itself had tried to hide it. A container, old, weathered, the kind used for storage, not meant to be here, not meant to be unseen. Daniel stepped closer, each movement slower now, more deliberate. Rex did not rush forward. He stayed where he was, watching Daniel, as if this part did not belong to him. Daniel reached the container and stopped, his breath catching without warning. The air around it felt still, heavier somehow. He placed a hand against the cold surface, rainwater slicked beneath his fingers. "Ethan," he called, his voice barely louder than the falling drops around them. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence stretching thin. Then a sound. Faint, soft, not a cry, not a shout. A small, uneven tapping from inside the metal, like someone who had learned not to waste strength, only to hold on to it. Daniel froze, every part of him locking in place as the sound came again, fragile but real. His hand pressed harder against the container, his breath breaking in a way he could not control. Behind him, the girl said nothing. Rex did not move. The forest held its silence. And for the first time in 36 hours, Daniel did not feel like he was searching anymore. Daniel did not think. Not in the way he had been trained to think. Not in procedures or checklists or measured responses. He moved on instinct. On something older. Something that bypassed the years of discipline and went straight to the part of him that still remembered what it meant to be a father before he was a badge. His hands searching the edge of the container, fingers slipping against cold metal until they found a seam. A handle worn smooth by time and weather. He pulled once, and it did not give. The weight of it resisting like the forest itself did not want to let go. His breath came sharper now, louder in the quiet, and he forced himself to slow down, to adjust, to try again, this time with control, with purpose. The latch shifted with a dull, reluctant sound, and something inside him broke open with it. Not fear, not yet, something closer to hope, but heavier, more dangerous, because hope could collapse just as easily as it rose. He opened the door just enough for darkness to spill outward, thick and still, and then he saw movement, small, unsteady, but real. "Ethan," he said, and the name did not come out as a command or a call. It came out like a memory, like something he had been holding on to without knowing if it would ever return. There was a pause, a fragile space where time seemed to stretch. Thin again, and then a voice answered, faint but unmistakable, "Dad?" The word landed softer than the rain, but it carried more weight than anything Daniel had heard in days. His knees nearly gave under him, but he held steady. He had to. He reached forward, carefully, not rushing, not breaking the moment, and helped the boy toward the opening. Ethan's hands were small against his arms, cold but responsive, alive. Daniel pulled him close without thinking, wrapping him in a hold that was not about strength, but about confirmation, about making sure this was real, that the voice matched the presence, that the space he had been staring into for 36 hours was no longer empty. Ethan leaned into him, not speaking again, just breathing, and that was enough, more than enough. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, just one, letting the world settle back into place around them. The forest, the rain, the weight, all of it shifting, recalibrating. Behind him, there was still no movement. No interruption, no urgency from the outside world, just the quiet presence of the girl and the dog, as if they had always known this was how it would unfold. Daniel pulled back slightly, just enough to look at his son's face, to check, to confirm. "You are okay," he said, not as a question, but as something he needed to hear out loud. Ethan nodded faintly, his voice still soft. "I tried to stay quiet," he said, "like you told me." Daniel's throat tightened at that. A memory surfacing of a lesson given without weight, something said in passing that had become something else entirely, something that had carried his son through silence. He swallowed hard and nodded. "You did good," he said, and the words felt small compared to what they held. He shifted slightly, positioning himself so Ethan could step out fully, keeping one hand on his shoulder, steady, constant, like letting go was no longer an option. When Ethan was clear, Daniel stood slowly, bringing him with him, grounding both of them in the moment. He turned then, instinctively, ready to call it in, to bring the world back into this place, to let the search end. But his eyes stopped short of that, landing instead on where the girl had been standing. The space was empty, not in the way someone steps aside, not in the way someone moves out of frame, but in the way something disappears without transition, without sound, without trace. Daniel blinked once, scanning the trees, the brush, the path behind them. "Hey," he called, not loudly, just enough to bridge the distance if there was any. But there was no answer, no movement, nothing. Only Rex remained, standing where he had been, watching, the same steady gaze, the same quiet presence. Daniel looked at the dog, something unspoken passing between them, something he could not name, but could feel. He stepped closer, Ethan still at his side, and crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the animal. "Where is she?" he asked, not expecting an answer in words, but asking anyway, because silence had already answered more than words could tonight. Rex did not move, did not turn. He simply held Daniel's gaze for a moment longer, then shifted his attention back toward the container, then to Ethan, then back to Daniel. A sequence, deliberate, complete, as if closing something unseen. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest changing, not gone, but different. He reached out, almost without thinking, and placed his hand gently against Rex's head, the fur damp, warm beneath his palm. The dog did not pull away, did not lean in. He simply accepted the contact, present, grounded, real. Unlike the girl who had led them here, Daniel stood. Again, his hand lingering for a second before falling back to his side. He finally reached for his radio, lifting it to his mouth, his voice steady now, clearer than it had been since this began. "This is Officer Hayes," he said. "I have my son." The words echoed slightly in the open air, carried through static and distance, but they held, they landed, and somewhere far behind them, the world would begin to move again. Lights, voices, footsteps, all of it returning. But here, in this small pocket of forest, there was a pause, a space where none of that had arrived yet. Daniel looked down at Ethan, then back at Rex, and for a moment, he did not feel like the one who had found anything at all. The radio crackled back almost instantly, voices overlapping, urgent but controlled, confirmation requests and coordinates bouncing through static as the search command center shifted from uncertainty to direction. But Daniel barely heard it. Not fully, not yet, because the world close to him still held a quieter gravity, one that did not rush, one that asked him to stay in this moment just a little longer. Ethan's hand tightened slightly in his sleeve, a small movement, but enough to pull Daniel's attention downward again, grounding him in what mattered. "Are we going home?" Ethan asked, his voice steadier now, not strong, but no longer fading. Daniel looked at him, really looked this time, at the lines of his face, the familiar curve of his brow, the way his eyes searched not for answers but for reassurance, and Daniel nodded, slow and certain. "Yeah," he said softly, "we are going home." The words felt different than before, no longer a hope, no longer a promise waiting to be fulfilled, but something real, something already in motion. He placed a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him as they began to move back the way they had come. Though the path did not feel the same anymore, the forest seemed less heavy now, less closed, as if something unseen had shifted with them. Rex fell in a step beside them, not leading this time, not guiding, just present, his pace matching theirs without command, without leash. Daniel noticed that, the difference, the change in the dog's role, and something about it stayed with him. They reached the shallow stream. Again, the water still running quietly over stones. Daniel paused for a moment, helping Ethan step through, lifting him slightly when needed, careful, deliberate, and Ethan followed without hesitation, trusting the motion, trusting him. On the other side, Daniel glanced back once more toward where the container had been, but the angle of the trees, the dark layering of branches, swallowed it from view, as if it had already begun to disappear into memory. They continued forward, the distant sound of voices growing clearer now. The search team closing in, lights flickering through the trees again, brighter, closer. The world returning in layers, one step at a time. "Daniel!" A voice called out, sharp but relieved. One of the officers breaking through the line of trees ahead, flashlight beam cutting across them before lowering quickly, recognition replacing urgency. "We got your signal," the officer said, breath slightly uneven from the pace, eyes moving quickly over Ethan, confirming, verifying. Daniel gave a short nod, not needing to explain yet, not needing to fill in details that still felt too fragile to put into words. The officer reached for his radio, relaying the update, and within seconds more movement followed, more figures, more light. The search was over, but Daniel remained still for a moment longer, just long enough to feel the shift fully settle. Hands reached out to Ethan gently, carefully, checking him, offering blankets, water. Questions kept soft, measured. Daniel stayed close, never letting the space between them widen, even as others stepped in, even as protocol resumed. And through it all, Rex stood just behind Daniel's right side, quiet, unobtrusive, as if aware that his part had already been completed. One of the officers glanced at the dog briefly, then back at Daniel. Where did he come from? The question was casual, practical, but it landed differently than intended. Daniel did not answer right away, his eyes shifting slightly, scanning the edges of the scene, the spaces between people, the lines of trees beyond the lights, looking for a small figure that was no longer there. He stepped back half a pace, turning just enough to check again, to be sure he had not missed something simple, something explainable, but there was nothing, no movement, no trace of where she had stood, no sound of retreating steps, just the quiet forest now filled again with voices that did not belong to her. Daniel looked back at Rex, the dog's posture unchanged, calm, grounded, present in a way that made everything else feel less certain. He brought us, Daniel said finally, the words simple, but carrying more than explanation. The officer nodded, accepting it without pressing. Because some things did not need to be questioned in moments like this, medics arrived. Quickly, kneeling beside Ethan, checking him gently, wrapping him in warmth, speaking in low, reassuring tones. Daniel stayed within arm's reach, answering only what was necessary, his attention divided but anchored, always returning to his son. And yet, beneath that, something else remained, something unresolved, not in a way that troubled him, but in a way that stayed open, like a door not meant to be closed. After a few minutes, as Ethan was guided toward the path leading back to the road, Daniel stepped aside briefly, turning once more toward Rex, the noise around them fading slightly in his awareness. He crouched again, meeting the dog's gaze at eye level. "You knew," he said quietly, not a question, not quite a statement, just an acknowledgement. Rex held his gaze for a moment, then shifted his eyes toward the dark line of trees behind them, then back again. A small motion, almost nothing, but enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest no longer sharp, no longer pressing, but settled into something deeper, something he would carry differently. He reached out, resting his hand once more against Rex's head, steady, grateful. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet, but clear, and for the first time that night, Rex moved, just slightly, leaning into the touch for a brief second before stepping back, not leaving, not disappearing, just releasing the moment. Daniel stood, turning back toward the lights, toward the voices, toward the world that had been waiting for him. And as he walked, he realized something he could not quite explain, that whatever had led him here had not needed recognition, had not waited for thanks. It had only needed him to follow. The ride back felt shorter than it should have, though Daniel knew the distance had not changed. The same narrow road cutting through the woods, the same dim glow of streetlights waiting beyond the tree line. But everything inside the vehicle had shifted, the silence no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with something quieter, something that did not need to be named. Ethan sat wrapped in a thick blanket in the back seat of the cruiser, his small frame leaning slightly toward Daniel, as if the space between them was something he did not want to risk widening again. His eyes were open now, alert in a soft, steady way, watching the passing lights blur across the window. "It was dark in there," Ethan said after a while, his voice calm, not afraid, just stating what had been. Daniel glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his grip on the steering wheel easing slightly. "I know," he said, keeping his tone even, grounding. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Ethan nodded, faintly, absorbing that, then looked down at his hands for a moment before speaking again. "I kept thinking I heard something," he said. Like someone was close, but not talking." Daniel felt a small shift in his chest at that, subtle but unmistakable. "What kind of something?" he asked carefully, not pushing, just listening. Ethan shrugged slightly, the blanket rustling around him. "Like when you are not alone, but you cannot see who is there," he said, his eyes lifting again to meet Daniel's in the mirror, searching for confirmation, not fear. Daniel held that gaze for a second, then nodded slowly. "Sometimes that happens," he replied, not explaining, not dismissing, just allowing the space for it to exist. The cruiser rolled past the last stretch of trees, The town coming into view with its quiet streets and familiar outlines, porch lights glowing softly in the early morning hours, everything appearing unchanged, ordinary, as if the last 36 hours had unfolded. Somewhere just outside of it, Daniel pulled into the hospital parking lot, the building already lit, staff waiting at the entrance, prepared, efficient, but not hurried, the kind of calm that came from knowing the outcome had shifted before they arrived. Daniel stepped out quickly, moving to open the back door, helping Ethan out with careful hands, keeping one steadying touch at his shoulder. The air felt different here, warmer, still, the scent of rain replaced by something cleaner, more controlled. As they walked toward the entrance, a nurse greeted them with a gentle smile, her voice soft, guiding Ethan inside, asking simple questions, offering reassurance without pressure. Daniel followed close behind, never letting more than a step separate them. Even as the process began to take over, vitals, observations, quiet checks that confirmed what Daniel already knew, that Ethan was safe, that he was here, that the waiting was over. But even as the room filled with quiet activity, Daniel found his attention shifting, just slightly, just enough to notice what was not there. He turned his head toward the hallway behind them, half expecting to see a small figure standing near the doorway, damp hair, steady eyes. But the space remained empty. Staff moved through it, purposeful, focused, but no one lingered. No one watched in the way she had. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing in a way they had not all night. Yet something remained, not tension, not unease, something closer to a question that did not need an answer. After a while, when the checks were done and the room had quieted again, Ethan shifted slightly on the bed, his gaze drifting toward the door. "Is the dog here?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of curiosity now, lighter than before. Daniel glanced back again, instinctively, then shook his head. "No," he said. He stayed behind. Ethan considered that, then nodded once, as if that made sense in a way he did not need to explain. He knew. Ethan added softly, more to himself than to Daniel. He knew where to go. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair beside the bed, his hand resting loosely on the edge of the mattress, his mind replaying the quiet steps through the forest, the way Rex had never rushed, never doubted, never questioned, just moved. And Daniel had followed, not because he understood, but because something in him had recognized the truth in it before he could name it. A doctor entered then, offering a few final reassurances, speaking in calm, measured tones about rest and observation, nothing urgent, nothing alarming. And when she left, the room settled again into stillness, the kind that allowed thoughts to rise without interruption. Daniel looked down at his right arm, at the faded tattoo etched into his skin. The lines softened with time, but still clear enough to recognize a German shepherd's profile, something he had gotten years ago, long before this night, long before he understood what it meant to trust something beyond what could be explained. He traced it lightly with his fingers, not out of habit, but out of awareness, then looked back at Ethan, who had already begun to drift toward sleep, his breathing steady, even. Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You are home," he said, not because Ethan needed to hear it again, but because he did, because saying it made it real in a way nothing else could. And as the first light of morning began to edge its way through the window, soft and pale against the walls, Daniel realized that some things were not meant to be understood in the way he had always understood the world. Some things were meant to be followed, trusted, and then quietly carried forward, without question, without explanation, just remembered. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly through the edges of the blinds, a pale, steady light that softened the room without asking permission. And Daniel had not moved much since the night ended, still seated beside the bed, his posture relaxed but not loose, the kind of stillness that came from someone who had finally stopped bracing for something to go wrong. Ethan slept with the calm of someone who had crossed through something unseen and come out the other side without needing to explain it, his breathing even, his face no longer searching, just resting. And for a long time Daniel simply watched, not out of worry, not out of fear, but because presence itself felt like something he had nearly lost and was not ready to take for granted again. The hospital moved around them in quiet rhythms, distant footsteps, muted voices, the soft hum of machines that did not demand attention, and somewhere between those sounds, Daniel realized how different silence could feel when it no longer carried absence, when it no longer echoed with unanswered questions. He leaned back slightly in the chair, his eyes drifting for a moment toward the window where the sky had begun to clear, the rain gone, leaving only a clean, open light behind. And with it came something else, a memory not from the search, not from the forest, but from before, years ago, a training field, a younger version of himself standing beside a canine handler, watching a German shepherd track something invisible across open ground. The handler had said something then, something Daniel had not thought about in years. They do not always follow scent, he had said. Sometimes they follow what we cannot see. At the time it had sounded like pride, like the kind of thing people said when they believed deeply in what they worked with. But now, sitting here, Daniel felt the weight of it differently, not as explanation, but as recognition. The door opened softly, pulling him back. A nurse stepped in, her movements light, respectful of the quiet in the room. "He is doing well," she said gently, glancing at Ethan before looking back at Daniel. "We will keep him for observation a few more hours, but everything looks good." Daniel nodded, offering a quiet thank you, his voice steady, grounded in something that had not been there before. She paused for a second, then added, "You can get some rest if you need." Daniel gave a small shake of his head, not dismissive, just certain. "I am good," he said, and she smiled faintly, understanding more than the words themselves. When she left, the room settled again, and Daniel's gaze shifted once more, not to Ethan this time, but to the hallway beyond the door, empty, ordinary, unchanged, and yet, part of him still looked, not expecting, not hoping, just acknowledging the absence of something that had been there in a way he could not define. He stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his legs, and walked toward the window, resting one hand lightly against the frame. Outside, the parking lot was beginning to fill, cars moving in quiet patterns, people stepping into their routines, unaware of what had unfolded just hours before, unaware of how close something had come to being lost, and how quietly it had been returned. Daniel's reflection stared back at him in the glass, faint but clear enough to recognize the same face, the same lines, but something behind the eyes had shifted, not hardened, not broken, but opened in a way that did not need to be explained. He looked down again at his right arm, at the tattoo that had always been a symbol, something chosen, something remembered, but now it felt different, not just ink, not just history, but connection, something that had reached beyond its meaning and into something real, something that had stood in front of him in the rain, silent, steady, and asked him to follow. Ethan stirred behind him then, a small movement, pulling Daniel back again. He turned quickly, but without urgency, just presence. "Dad." Ethan's voice was soft, still carrying sleep. Daniel stepped back to the bed, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "I am right here," he said, and Ethan nodded, his eyes half open. "I had a dream," he murmured. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Yeah?" Ethan blinked slowly, as if trying to hold on to something that was already fading. "I was not alone," he said, even when it was dark. Daniel felt that same quiet shift again, the one that did not demand understanding, only acknowledgement. "I know," he replied, his voice low, steady, and Ethan relaxed back into the pillow, the tension leaving his body without effort. Daniel remained there, his hand still resting on his son's shoulder, not moving, not speaking, just present. And in that stillness, he understood something he had not before, that not every truth needed to be proven, not every answer needed to be found. Some things simply arrived when they were needed most, and left just as quietly, leaving behind only what mattered, a life returned, a bond restored, and a path that, for once, had been followed without question. The hours passed without urgency, the kind of time that did not push or pull, just moved quietly forward as if careful not to disturb what had already been restored. And by late morning the room felt lighter, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because the weight that had once filled it was gone, replaced by something steady and unspoken. Ethan sat up now, the blanket folded loosely at his side, a cup of water in his hands that he held more out of habit than need. His color had returned, not fully, but enough to remind Daniel of what normal used to look like. What? It still could be. Can we go home today? Ethan asked, his voice carrying a quiet hope that did not press too hard. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair, studying him for a moment before answering. Not out of doubt, but out of care. Soon, he said. The doctor just wants to be sure everything is good. Ethan nodded, accepting that without resistance, his gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight now fell fully across the glass, bright and clear. No trace of the storm left behind. Daniel followed that gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but shared, comfortable in a way that had not existed before. A soft knock came at the door, followed by the entrance of one of Daniel's colleagues, Officer Ramirez, his presence calm, respectful. He stepped in slowly, as if aware that this room held something fragile, something that did not need to be disturbed. Hey, Ramirez said quietly, offering a small nod, his eyes moving from Daniel to Ethan, confirming what he had already heard over the radio hours ago. Good to see you, kid, he added, his tone gentle. Ethan gave a small smile in return, not fully formed, but genuine. Ramirez shifted his weight slightly, then looked back at Daniel. They are wrapping things up out there, he said. Search is officially closed. Daniel nodded once, the words landing with a finality that felt different than expected. Not heavy, not abrupt, just complete. Ramirez hesitated for a second, then added, we went back through the area this morning. Just to be thorough. Daniel's attention sharpened slightly, his posture adjusting without him realizing it. And, he asked. Ramirez exhaled quietly, not troubled, but thoughtful. There is no container, he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that shifted the air in the room. Daniel did not respond immediately, his eyes holding on Ramirez for a moment longer, searching not for contradiction, but for confirmation. What do you mean no container? He asked, his voice still even, still controlled. Ramirez shook his head slightly. We checked the coordinates you gave, walked the whole section twice. There is nothing there, he said. No tracks, no debris. Nothing that matches what you described. The room grew quieter around them, not tense, not uneasy, just still. Ethan looked between them, his expression curious but not alarmed, as if the information did not carry the same weight for him. Daniel leaned back slowly, his hand resting against his arm again, fingers brushing lightly over the faded outline of the tattoo, his mind moving through the memory not as something uncertain, but as something he had experienced fully, something that did not need to be verified to exist. He was there, Daniel said finally, not defensive, not questioning, just stating what he knew. Ramirez held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, accepting that without challenge, because there were things in this line of work that did not always fit into reports or explanations, and sometimes the outcome mattered more than the path that led to it. That is what matters, Ramirez said quietly, glancing once more at Ethan, then back at Daniel before stepping toward the door. Take your time here, he added. We will handle the rest. Daniel gave a slight nod in return, and when Ramirez left, the room settled again. But something had shifted, not in a way that unsettled, but in a way that clarified. Daniel looked down at Ethan, who was watching him now, his eyes steady, thoughtful. It is okay, Ethan said softly. Daniel blinked once, caught slightly off guard by the certainty in his voice. What is okay? He asked, and Ethan shrugged. Lightly, not knowing, he replied, the words simple, but carrying a quiet understanding that did not belong to someone his age. Daniel studied him for a moment, then allowed a small breath to leave his chest. Not heavy, not forced, just released. Yeah, he said, nodding slowly. It is. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze shifting once more toward the empty hallway beyond the door. Not searching now, not expecting, just acknowledging the space where something had been, something that had come without explanation and left without trace, leaving behind only what had been needed, nothing more, nothing less. And in that space, Daniel found something he had not realized he had been missing. Not answers, not control, but trust, not in a system, not in a process, but in something quieter, something that did not need to be understood to be followed. And as the light continued to fill the room, steady and unchanged, Daniel realized that some paths were not meant to be mapped, only walked, and sometimes The ones who led you there did not stay long enough to be known, only long enough to make sure you arrived. They were discharged just after noon. The process quiet and uncomplicated, paperwork signed with steady hands, instructions given in calm voices that carried no urgency, as if everyone understood that what mattered most had already happened hours before. Daniel walked beside Ethan through the hospital corridor, his pace unhurried, his attention fixed not on the exit ahead but on the presence beside him. The sound of their footsteps soft against the polished floor, each one grounding in a way that felt new. Outside, the air had changed completely, the storm gone without a trace, leaving behind a sky so clear it almost felt unfamiliar. Sunlight stretched across the parking lot in long, warm lines, and for a moment Daniel paused, letting it settle, letting the difference between night and now fully register. Ethan stepped forward first, breathing in deeply as if testing the world again, then looked back with a small, quiet smile. "It feels different," he said. Daniel nodded once, understanding exactly what he meant without needing to define it. "Yeah," he replied. "It does." They reached the cruiser, and Daniel opened the passenger door this time. Not the back, a small shift, but intentional. Ethan climbed in, settling into the seat. With a comfort that had returned more quickly than expected, Daniel closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if nothing needed to be rushed anymore. The engine started with a low hum, and for a moment they sat there, not moving, not speaking, just present in the quiet space between departure and return. "Are we going the same way?" Ethan asked, glancing toward the road ahead. Daniel followed his gaze, the familiar route stretching out in front of them, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "We will take a different road." He did not explain why, and Ethan did not ask. The cruiser pulled out slowly, turning away from the main road, toward a quieter stretch that wound along the edge of the woods. Not the same path as before, but close enough that the line of trees remained within view, a boundary between what was known and what was not. The drive was calm, the town moving around them in its usual rhythm, people crossing streets, cars passing without notice, life continuing in a way that did not pause for stories like theirs. And yet, inside the vehicle, everything felt marked by it, shaped by something unseen. As they approached the edge of the forest, Daniel slowed slightly, his eyes drifting toward the tree line, scanning without urgency, not searching for proof, not expecting to find anything, just acknowledging the place where something had changed. Ethan noticed the shift, his gaze following. "Is that where we were?" he asked. Daniel nodded faintly. "Somewhere in there," he said, not pointing, not narrowing it down, because the exact place no longer felt important. Ethan leaned slightly toward the window, studying the trees with quiet curiosity, then sat back, as if satisfied with what he could not see. They drove a little further, the road curving gently, until Daniel eased the cruiser to a stop near a small clearing just off the shoulder. Nothing remarkable about it, just a break in the trees where sunlight reached the ground. The engine idled softly as Daniel stepped out, the air warm against his skin, carrying the scent of dry earth and leaves. Ethan followed, stepping onto the gravel with a lightness that had returned to his movements. They stood there for a moment, side by side, facing the trees, not speaking, not needing to, the silence different now, not heavy, not questioning, just open. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving across the clearing, the line of trees beyond it, and for a brief second, something caught his attention, not movement, not sound, just the impression of presence, the kind that did not linger long enough to be confirmed, but long enough to be felt. He did not step forward, did not call out. He simply stood there, acknowledging it without reaching for it. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if sensing something similar, then looked up at Daniel. "Do you think she is still out there?" he asked, his voice quiet. Daniel took a slow breath, the question settling without pressure, without demand. "I think," he said carefully, "she was where she needed to be." Ethan considered that, then nodded once, accepting it without needing more. The wind moved lightly through the trees, a soft rustle that carried no message, no direction, just sound. Daniel glanced down at his arm again, at the faded outline of the dog inked into his skin, then back toward the clearing, and for the first time, He did not feel the need to connect it, to define it, to understand it. Some things did not belong to explanation, they belonged to experience, to the quiet space where something had been given and did not need to be taken apart to be real. He placed a hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder, a steady, grounding touch. "Come on," he said, and they turned back toward the cruiser, the moment complete without needing to be extended. As they drove away, the clearing disappeared behind them, the trees closing in again, returning to what they had always been, just part of the landscape. But Daniel knew, in a way he did not need to explain, that not every path through those woods could be found again, not every guide could be called back, and that was not something to question, only something to carry, quietly, forward. The road home felt quieter than it ever had before, not because the town had changed, but because something inside Daniel had. The familiar streets stretching ahead in soft afternoon light, houses standing still in their usual places, porches lined with chairs that had witnessed countless ordinary days. And yet this day carried something else beneath it, something that would not fade as easily as the morning rain had. Ethan sat beside him, no longer leaning, no longer holding on, just present, watching the world pass by with a calm that did not need to be forced. And every now and then Daniel would glance at him, not out of worry, not out of habit, but out of quiet recognition, as if seeing him again required a second kind of understanding. They turned onto their street slowly, the tires rolling over pavement that felt more familiar than anything Daniel had touched in hours, maybe days. And when the house came into view, something in Daniel's chest shifted again, not sharp, not overwhelming, just a steady release. The front yard looked the same, the mailbox slightly tilted, the small patch of grass near the walkway worn thin where Ethan used to run across it. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Daniel parked the cruiser and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was different from the others, not heavy, not waiting, just complete. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt without being told, pushing the door open and stepping out into the afternoon light. He paused for a second on the driveway, looking at the house as if seeing it from a distance for the first time, then took a few steps forward, slow at first, then more certain. Daniel followed behind, not rushing, not needing to, each step measured, grounded. The front door opened with a familiar sound, and the air inside carried the quiet scent of home, untouched, unchanged, as if it had been waiting without knowing why. Ethan stepped in first, his shoes soft against the floor, his eyes moving across the room, taking in details that had always been there: the couch, the small table near the window, the framed photo on the wall, everything exactly as he had left it. Daniel stood just inside the doorway for a moment, watching him, letting the scene settle, letting the reality of it anchor fully. This was not a return to what had been. It was something quieter, something deeper, a continuation shaped by what had almost been lost. Ethan turned slightly, looking back at him. "It feels the same," he said, his voice soft but sure. Daniel nodded once, stepping further inside. "That is a good thing," he replied, and Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that did not need to be wide to be real. The afternoon passed slowly, not marked by anything significant, just small movements, water running in the sink, a chair being pulled out, footsteps moving from one room to another, the ordinary sounds of a life that had been interrupted and now resumed without ceremony. And yet every small action carried weight, not heavy, not burdensome, but meaningful in a way that only came after something had nearly been taken away. Later, as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows through the windows, Daniel stepped out onto the front porch alone. The air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of evening. He leaned lightly against the railing, his eyes drifting toward the street. Then beyond it, toward the distant line of trees that marked the edge of town. They stood there quietly, unchanged from where they had always been. And yet Daniel knew that somewhere within them, something had shifted his understanding in a way that would not return to what it had been before. He rested his forearms on the railing, his gaze steady, not searching, not expecting, just present. The world moved softly around him, a car passing in the distance, the sound of a door closing somewhere down the block, life continuing in its quiet rhythm. And then, without warning, without sound, there was a moment, brief, almost nothing, where the air felt different, Not colder, not warmer, just aware. Daniel's eyes shifted slightly, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge what could not be seen. And in that space, he felt it again, not as presence, not as memory, but as something that did not need a form to be real. He did not speak, did not move. He simply stood there, allowing it to pass without reaching for it, because he understood now that some things were not meant to stay, only to guide. And when the moment slipped away, as quietly as it had come, Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling into a calm that felt earned rather than given. Behind him, he heard Ethan's footsteps approach, light, unhurried, the door opening softly. "Dad?" Ethan's voice carried through the quiet evening. Daniel turned slightly, not fully, just enough to meet his eyes. "Yeah," he answered, and Ethan stepped beside him, looking out at the same stretch of street, the same fading light. "Do you think we will see them again?" he asked, the question simple, open. Daniel considered it for a moment, not searching for the right answer, not measuring his words, just allowing what he felt to take shape. "I do not know," he said honestly, his voice calm, steady, "but I think we will always know when we are not alone." Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that in the same quiet way he had accepted everything else, and they stood there together as the light continued to fade, not speaking, not needing to, because some stories did not end with answers. They ended with understanding, the kind that did not need to be explained, only carried forward in the quiet spaces, in the ordinary moments, in the steady presence of knowing that even when the path is unclear, there are still things that guide us home.